Please join me in welcoming the keynote speaker, Dr. Jeff Shonkoff from Harvard University. And the title of his talk is Leveraging the Biology of Adversity to Strengthen the Foundations of Healthy Development.
Thank you, Li Wei, and Barbara, thanks very much for those comments. When I submitted the title for my presentation, I didn't know I would be honored by keynoting, so I changed the title of my presentation to kind of be more appropriate for being in the first spot. So what I'm going to do is I'd like to kind of create a framework for this incredible collection of presentations that everyone will hear during the day. And this notion of a crossroads in my mind is not just the crossroads of bringing together scientists and practitioners and policymakers and thought leaders, but that we really are at a crossroads in how we think about this issue and this field going forward. And I think the greatest risk is that we just keep doing the same things and thinking in the same way and not capitalizing on all of this kind of new information, knowledge, and insights. So let me just jump right in, and I'm going to here's what I want to do. For starters, this notion of the cumulative pileup of adversity leading to bad things is, it's probably a couple of hundred years old. These data are taken from a study, since we're focusing on childhood, and particularly early childhood. Thank you for that, Barbara and Li Wei. So this is a study of children who are in the child welfare system across the country. The question is not how bad is it to be a victim of abuse or neglect, but what if there's a pileup of other risk factors, the usual suspects: limited education, poverty in the family, mental illness in the family. And what you get in this national study that was done about 10 years ago is what you get in every study you ever do, is that a couple of risk factors doesn't do you in. We're not that fragile. If we were, we would be extinct as a species. But after a certain amount of pileup of adversity, hardly anybody could get through without having some sequelae. And I know the focus of this meeting is mental health, and we will kind of keep on that focus. But basically, the same thing applies to physical health and to learning, as Barbara intimated. So we also have another approach to this issue. I doubt there's a person in the audience here who doesn't know about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This is one of several areas within this study looked at the relationship between adversity in childhood and, in this case, depression as an adult. I picked that because we're about early stress and mental health. But what's important about this, other than the fact that here we go with that same old pattern, the more risk factors, the more likely you are to have heart disease, actually heart disease as well, but depression decades later, is that this study was done as a retrospective study in a middle-class population. It's not poor people. These are people who are middle class, who had successful lives by and large, but when asked about, with all of the limitations of recall in a retrospective study, when asked about whether they experienced any one of 10 adversities in childhood, those who had more adversities had more depression, heart disease, various forms of cancer, addictions, the list goes on and on. I'm going to come back to the ACEs study in a couple of minutes. So actually 11 years ago, and where's Bruce McEwen? Is Bruce here? Hi, Bruce. So Bruce, as one of my colleagues from the National Scientific Council on Developing Child, so this goes back to 2 years before the publication of this working paper, which did not have toxic stress in the title because the scientists couldn't agree on putting toxic stress in the title because some people thought it sounded like the National Enquirer. But what we did is we put together, looked at, and a lot of it was work pioneered by certainly Bruce as a leading scientist, this notion that there are physiological disruptions that occur in the body as a result of excessive adversity, and that stress by itself is a normal part of life. So the idea is not to avoid stress. And in fact, some serious stresses are weathered by children who are surrounded by adults who help them get through, but that there is a subset of the population for whom excessive stress activation without the buffering protection of adult support and responsive caregiving actually end up with sequelae that can last a lifetime, even if the adversity doesn't continue. And we coined the term toxic stress, didn't put it in the title because Some of the scientists didn't like it, and we lost control of that term. It went viral, and it's both been useful and also been very much misused by lots of people. Not everybody living in poverty is experiencing toxic stress. There are people living in very good environments who are experiencing toxic stress. Not everyone living in a violent environment is experiencing it, but clearly there is a significant part of the population for whom physiological changes are going along with this chronic exposure to adversity, and this is a serious issue. And what I think was part of the reason this caught on was because it was really not the first time that people talked about stress being bad for you, but it began to explain to people what actually goes on inside the body. This notion of understanding what's happening as opposed to just being given numbers is very important. Now, again, I'm sorry, Bruce, I don't mean to just keep cheering you on here, but 3 years later, Bruce and Tom and Tom Boyce and I got the first mention of toxic stress in the peer-reviewed literature, which kind of then got that out, at least to say it's one thing if you do a working paper, it's another thing if the scientific community starts to kind of accept and use that term. And 3 years after that, which is not that long ago, and we have some leaders of this as members of the American Academy of Pediatrics on the program today, is that the AAP did a technical report and a policy statement that put toxic stress on the map as an issue, just as you had alluded to, Barbara, that this is something that pediatricians need to start paying explicit attention to because it is so much a kind of a substantial early indicator of the likelihood of not only problems not being ready to succeed in school, but the early roots of lifelong chronic illness that kind of exact a tremendous toll on the people who have them and the society that has to deal with that. So these reports kind of stimulated, and the American Academy of Pediatrics just came out with a policy statement on poverty this year. But so here's part of the challenge. Here's the crossroads issue. Identifying the problem doesn't mean that we know what to do about it, right? And sometimes we get lulled into this sense that we're getting better and better at describing and analyzing, at getting deeper into causal mechanisms. So what I love about the scientific community says we're barely beginning to scratch the surface of understanding the underlying mechanisms, because what's wonderful about where science is going, it's not concerned, the concept is like, well, yeah, of course, the science is concerned which molecule, kind of which system at the kind of underlying, maybe at the cellular or molecular level. That's where a lot of the exciting interest and work is in research right now. But so this is on everybody's, well, not everybody's, it's on a lot of people's agendas. And what I want to do is now kind of tee this up to say, so how can we make today a really productive day to see where science has a critical role to play? What about the people who are out there working with children and families, and what about policymakers and thought leaders? So for starters, this is the summary of what the biology says. There'll be much more elegant descriptions of this during the day. Early experiences are literally built into our bodies. They're embedded biologically for good or for bad. So what we know, I'm now summarizing in one slide, 75 years of child development research and neuroscience and epigenetics, that stable and supportive relationships, language-rich environments, mutually responsive serve and return interactions between children and the adults who are caring for them kind of promote healthy brain architecture, promote well-regulated metabolic systems, promote healthy cardiovascular systems, and make up what we kind of what we colloquially refer to as the building blocks of resilience, right? This is the problem of the consequence of adversity is not, it would be nice, but it's beyond our grade level and our expertise to eliminate poverty and racism and violence. I mean, that would be the big enchilada. That would really bring us a long way. Our job is to say, in the meantime, what could we be doing while other people need to be working on these? And the problem is that, these are the building blocks, and we know these building blocks of healthy development. Excessive or prolonged activation of the stress response system, we're increasingly understanding, has a lot of bad effects. The persistent elevation of heart rate and blood pressure, serum glucose, and inflammatory cytokines, and stress hormones, and all of these physiological changes that can literally disrupt developing brain architecture, can accelerate atherosclerosis, can increase insulin resistance, can affect the immune system, and the list goes on and on. So with all these distinguished scientists here, I'm going to move on to the frame now, because you're going to talk about the deeper stuff. So here's where we have to start. There still is, although I have to admit, I respect its reality, but I don't understand the continuing confusion. So I'm going to take 1 minute to try to clarify the distinctions among three terms that are out here all the time and they're used interchangeably, and they're not at all interchangeable. And they all have benefits and they all have limitations. And here are the three conceptual frameworks. The first is toxic stress, which we've talked about. Toxic stress refers to physiological disruptions that are produced by excessive activation of stress systems. Toxic stress is a concept. It is not yet a metric. Thank you, JPB Foundation. We have a network that is working very hard on this, and within the next 1 to 2 years, we will have metrics for measuring toxic stress and be able to not just say, oh, these kids must be having toxic stress, but who is and who isn't. But it helps us understand the causal mechanisms that explain why adversity leads to impairment. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The second concept is an ACE score. An ACE score is not toxic stress. They're two very different things. An ACE score is a 10-item screening measure of child maltreatment and household dysfunction. It comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study done, I mentioned it earlier, in the 1990s. It's had a voluminous literature since. An ACE score is a quantitative measure of a restricted set of risk factors. It does not include poverty. It does not include violence. It does not include any of these larger kind of societal and neighborhood contextual variables. It's about what goes on in the family in terms of abuse or neglect or family dysfunction around mental illness or intimate violence. Remember, this was derived from a middle-class population, so poverty and living in a violent community were not part of what people we're dealing with. And an ACE score is not a diagnosis of an individual. It's an elegant quantification of risk factors that are associated with problems. Lots of people with problems have low ACE scores. Lots of people with high ACE scores don't have problems. And then the third issue is trauma-informed care. I will say of the three, this is the one I know the least about, but I'm trying real hard to learn about. This is an approach to treating people who have a history, a significant history of trauma, or violence, or emotionally harmful traumatic experiences. And it has a set of principles and guidelines about how to customize treatments for individuals who are experiencing significant mental health problems related to early trauma. It's a framework for specialized treatment. And I have to say, as I've been learning more about it, the definition of trauma-informed practice is kind of articulated differently by different people, although there's a core set of principles. And the evidence base is really just emerging about whether trauma-informed treatment is more effective than standard treatment for a lot of problems that occur with significant frequency among people who've experienced trauma. So we have one concept that's talking about causal mechanisms, another that is quantifying risk factors in the early family environment, and the third that are principles of treatment. They should not be confused. They're three parts of a compelling story about how we can move forward. So let me now move. This is good. I'm actually doing well on time. So to basically tee up, the rest of what I have to say is not grounded in empirical data to demonstrate that what I'm saying is true, or at least is backed up by good evidence. It's sharing with you a framework and a way of thinking about how we can move forward, beginning with the best of what we know, beginning with the best of the science that we have, beginning with the best practice out there, beginning with the best and most kind of scientifically grounded thinking from a policy perspective. Kind of where do we go next? And the first thing that really emerges when you think about these two fields coming together is that we are missing an R&D platform in this field. If we define the field as, and let's just say for today's conference, the early childhood space around how we deal with adversity, how we deal with early stress, and how we prevent, ideally, reduce, next best, or mitigate, if we can't prevent it, the impacts of adversity. And so this is a curve taken from the work some of you may be familiar with of Everett Rogers, who has done seminal work on how innovation diffuses through any kind of system or society. And so kind of here's applied to the world we're talking about now, here's the value of Rogers' kind of conceptualization. There's a part of the field that is really dealing with basic quality issues that have to be addressed. programs that don't have the staffing or the expertise or the resources to really provide state-of-the-art care. There are a lot of them out there who are being asked to deal with problems that are way beyond their capacity to respond, but not beyond our ability to respond, but these programs don't have it. So there are basic quality issues. These involve quality improvement, they involve staff development, they involve resources to bring people up to basic good practices. Every field has that. The goal is not to eliminate it, it's to reduce it. Then there are the part of the field that's meeting standards. We have basic standards of what we think we should be doing for children, although God knows where we certainly don't have a clear sense of exactly everyone agreeing on what that is, but what are the standards of what we should be doing for children living in poverty and families raising children in poverty or under adverse circumstances related to community violence, related to racism, related to a lot of the other factors that we know are associated with poor outcomes over time. So there is a hunk of the field that is meeting the standards, whether they be set by agencies or policy sectors that set standards for what are considered to be acceptable care. And then there's a part of the field as we go over the top of the curve and start to move to where we have to go and have to put more investment, is people who are delivering state-of-the-art. State-of-the-art policies, state-of-the-art services, state-of-the-art practices that represent the best of what we've ever been able to figure out. And in some, we know if we take medical research as an example, we know, and if we look over time, that there are diseases for which the treatments and the effects have been staggering in their progress, and state-of-the-art is moving very rapidly. There are others where we've been kind of stuck. We don't give up. We don't say, what's the point of wasting money on this basic research? But the cutting edge of state-of-the-art may not be moving as quickly. But state-of-the-art is kind of where we aim. And I'd like to suggest that what's missing in this field is the part of the field that says state-of-the-art should be the starting point. And the question is, where do we go next? Because the only time we should accept state-of-the-art as the endpoint is when we've completely solved the problem. Then the issue is, how do we make sure that everybody is at state-of-the-art? How do we adequately fund these? But we're not there yet. Certainly we're not there yet in terms of alleviating the effects of poverty on families raising children. So this gets to the R&D platform that all healthy fields have in other areas. In the world of business, I have to say, I wish I had paid attention to what smart businesses do early in my career. I think we have a lot to learn from them. If you're in the business world and you're at the top of your field, you don't stay at the top of your field unless you put some part of your resources in figuring out how to get to where the field is going next before everybody else. You don't just kind of sit on your laurels. It's the same thing, obviously, in biomedical research. So we don't have an adequate piece of our landscape right now where people are generating and testing new ideas across sectors. Waiting to, particularly for that first string, the early adopters, the people who are saying, I don't know, I can't figure this out, or I don't have time to figure it out, but as soon as you have something better, will you tell me? And I want to be the first to do it. And what's different about this kind of brand of investigation is that unlike most of the field, and I say this not in a critical way, because as a part of the field and having early in my career been practicing in a context, we all know that the standard way to survive in the field is to prove that what you're doing is making a difference. That's very different from finding out whether what you're trying is making a difference, and if it is, for whom and how. And that's the piece that's missing. So if we think that we're at a crossroads where we need to bring together science and practice and policy and thought leadership, most of our energy and resources should go into best practices, state-of-the-art, and bringing everybody up to standards. It's only a small part of the field and the resources that needs to be kind of pushing where's the future going. But so here the question then becomes, what does 21st century science have to say to that? Where do we begin? Because at this point, we're not going to make big leaps forward based on ideology and advocacy. We're going to make big steps forward by understanding the underlying science here. And as we've looked at the science, 3 huge messages come out to us as new ways of thinking about intervening early in life for children facing adversity. The first is that early experiences affect lifelong health, not just learning. as a policy issue, as an investment issue. This is largely on the departments of education. It's largely on educational systems. And we're missing the point that the science is basically trying to get us to pay attention to, is this is not just about coming to kindergarten, knowing some letters, but it's about the early roots of all of the budget busters that were mentioned earlier in the healthcare system. The second is that healthy development requires protection of the developing brain and other developing organs, not just the provision of enriched learning experiences. And all of our interventions and our policies are focused on enrichment, and many of these programs that provide wonderfully enriched opportunities, hypothesis now, maybe some children aren't benefiting from them, not because you need a better curriculum, but we're not protecting their developing brains so that they can be in a position to benefit more from what we have evidence are good interventions. And the third one is the most complicated, but I've come to believe, again, latest hypothesis, right? Either some 5-10 years from now, we'll either know this was right or we'll be saying something else. We won't be saying the same thing if we don't kind of learn that this is right. Is that everything we know about development and what we're learning at the, excuse me, at the biological level is how this kind of contingent reciprocity in this relationship between the environment and genetics, and the active ingredient, the environment, is the caregiving environment and the relationships, that if we want to produce much better outcomes for children facing adversity, we have to help support the adults who are caring for them to change their lives. It's not enough to just say, here's what you can do for your child. If you're homeless, if you can't keep food on the table, talking to your child more and reading to your child more is good. No question about it, but who would think that that's the answer to poverty? So it's really, this is more complicated. It's not something pediatricians do in their office, but the science is saying to us we ignore this dimension at our peril. So I want to use, this is not, I'm a little bit uncomfortable saying this is not a kind of self-promotion about the JPB Research Network on toxic stress, but this is where a lot of our energy is going right now with generous support from the foundation, which obviously has been fantastic for us to address this issue, is to dig deeper into the science and to kind of, with the mind to, how is this going to kind of help on the policy and the practice end. And this network, which is 1 year old, so don't ask us yet what we found. We've only been in this for 1 year. We haven't solved all the problems yet. But here are the 3 things that we're focused on. The first is the challenge of measurement. So this emerging availability of biological and biobehavioral measures that have the best predictive validity we can get. Not just, oh, we can measure something, but how do we know about how much it's a predictor of greater likelihood of disease later, and that are sensitive to intervention effects. So we can have a measure of whether what we're trying is reducing physiological disruptions, as opposed to saying, trust me, it'll work. The 60-year follow-up study will show that when we have less heart disease. And also has to be acceptable to parents and acceptable and feasible in a pediatric setting. And the acceptability to parents is critical because the history of bringing biology into disadvantaged communities is largely an ugly history, particularly for communities of color. And when you talk about biological measures, it triggers, for most people, very few positive examples of ways in which biology has helped disadvantaged populations, as opposed to stigmatizing and inappropriately labeling. So this network, with the wonderful planning that we did together with the foundation, has 3 constituencies. It has an incredibly distinguished group of scientists around the country. It has an amazing group of creative pediatricians who are really interested in being at the edge of what we can do. And it has 6 opposite of wallflower community leaders who are at the table, who are very worried about the misuse of this, but very invested in its possibilities and why it's important. And so the measurement issue for us is potentially game-changing. Everyone here knows that no breakthroughs happen in any scientific endeavor without new measurement capacity that allows us to look at things that we haven't been able to do before. The second issue is a deeper dive into research on neuroplasticity and critical periods in development. We have this general notion out there in the public that earlier is better than later, and that it's better to prevent things than it is to treat them later, and that's, boy, is that true, and it stands on very solid scientific evidence. But the science is allowing us to be much better at this and much more precise than just early is better than later. And then the issue also is that critical periods well, actually, I'm going to give you some examples in a second, so let me just hold that and go to the next issue, which is research on variation in stress susceptibility. Okay? It makes no sense scientifically to ask a generic question about sensitivity or susceptibility to stress effects. There are differences. Looking at children living in the same circumstances and families living in the same circumstances, some do much better than others. Some don't do very well at all. When we provide an intervention and we do it as well as we can do it, some benefit a lot from it and some don't. And if we couldn't figure out what to do about that, we'd say, gee, it would be nice if somebody could give us some ideas about how to figure that out. Welcome 21st century biology, which has the capacity increasingly to help us get a deeper dive into how do we understand the interaction between experiences and relationships and their effect on gene expression and their effect on kind of developing organs and understanding the relative contributions to why this is the heart of what precision medicine is kind of all about as it's going forward. That same thinking with a lot of adaptation ought to be on the table for us thinking about poverty. Nobody would say, you have an infection, okay, we'll give you an antibiotic. Nobody would say you have cancer, okay, we'll give you a treatment for cancer. They say, what kind of infection, what kind of antibiotic, what have we tried, what's worked, what hasn't. So why do we say you're living in poverty, what's the best program? It doesn't make any sense. You're in a violent environment, what's the best program? Doesn't make any sense. The beauty is we have science ready to come to the table, not with answers. The other thing I love about the scientists I work with is they don't know what to recommend about interventions, but what they can bring to the table is new ways of thinking, and generating new hypotheses that then people who develop programs and deliver them can then turn that into something to try, and not try it with the idea of gather as much data as you can to prove that it works, but try it to find out whether it works. And if it doesn't, don't be afraid to say this didn't work. What have we learned from it? That's how innovation takes place. So just to give you a few examples, this notion of the impact of early adversity and early stress on critical periods, we have evidence. Most of this comes from animal studies, thank goodness for rodents, in terms of our understanding of neurobiology, that the critical period for the development of fear circuitry in rats, the circuits from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, there's evidence arising that in the presence of significant early maternal separation, the critical period is shifted earlier. It starts earlier and it ends earlier. There's also interesting evidence from the Bucharest Romanian orphanage study that there are some aspects of early development that seem to reverse pretty easily when children were adopted before age 2 out of the orphanage, and some, particularly attention, that never seem to come back, suggesting that there may be a critical period for some foundational dimensions of attention that may be as early as the first 6 months or a year of life. What if that's true? What if that's true? What is this kind of policy arena we have now that says we hear the science, we understand the biology, early matters, so we're putting our resources into pre-K for 4-year-olds. And we don't really know what to do before age 4, but we'll have some home visiting programs, and I'm sure they're going to help people through. We could do much better than that. We could be much more precise about why, for which kinds of, for whom in the population is 4 not remotely early enough, and for whom is it fine? And what are the things we should be focusing on? Where are those questions? And that's the intersection of science and policy and practice. To ask those questions and not give up until we have a better understanding of what to do about them. The development of executive function skills and self-regulation, this has the longest period of development. It starts in early infancy with focused attention, and it doesn't complete until age 25 to 30 years, this kind of higher level executive functions. It gets a lot of attention in the press about the difference between the adolescent and the adult brain, those kinds of things. Well, so here's an interesting thing science is telling us. Executive function skills, which are foundational for not just learning, but for well-regulated behavior and the kind of behavior that makes you less likely to get into stress-related illness. The steepest curve, steepest period of development is in the period of 3 to 5 years. But there's another period of increased plasticity, age 15 to 25 to 30, where these higher level skills have optimal plasticity for their development. And we know that these skills don't come in on automatic pilot. They're shaped by coaching and by scaffolding, and they're improved by practice. So here's a nice science question for the practice arena. So age 25 to 30, I think there are a lot of young parents in that age range, and a lot of them poor, and a lot of them dealing with a lot of stress. And the plasticity for developing higher level executive function skills that, by the way, you need to get out of poverty to get a job. And you also need to create a well-regulated home environment to promote healthy development. And we know these skills are developed by coaching and practice. And we're giving people information and advice. That's not how it works. Suggesting, well, let's think about this. Here's a new way to kind of move in a different direction. And then we have the variation issue. So this is the classic, it's true in every country for hundreds of years. It's not just about access to healthcare and access to good schools. There is a social class gradient in development and health. These data are taken from a national study in Canada looking at vocabulary scores related to SES, and it shows this predictable curve. It's a little less steep in Canada than it is in the United States, right? But the important finding here is not the median, it's not the curve, it's the scatter. It's the variation. There are lots of kids living in poverty with better vocabularies than kids living in well-educated, economically secure homes. So although on average this is right, understanding the variation is really critical. So I'm going to end. This is good. This is good. I wasn't quite sure I fit all this in. Again, back to the crossroads, back to the opportunities. It would be tragic for a meeting of this caliber with this quality audience and the quality of the presentations, for all of us to leave here without thinking that the biggest challenge is what are we going to do differently, as opposed to this is great. We have more knowledge to bolster what we're doing, because what we're doing is not enough. It's not to say that it's not good, because we have a lot of evidence that we're making a difference, but we need to aim higher. We need to not settle for just statistically significant differences of relatively modest magnitude. So this gets us to the issue not only of where the idea is going to come from, how do we put some things in place, how do we train people, how do we match services, but how do we evaluate whether we're making progress? And again, I'm just kind of putting this out to be provocative, but I actually believe it. But I believe it as where we need to go, not as we figured it all out. So here's where we are right now, which is one of the reasons why achieving impact at scale has been so difficult, in my opinion, right, for whatever it's worth. I'm one person. So think of this as a scatter plot of the results of a test of an intervention for children in poverty experiencing significant adversity and whatever we want, and whatever the intervention was and whatever the measures were. And we get this scatter of responses. So that red line is kind of no effect. So the spots below, kids actually were doing worse, and the spots above, kids were doing better with varying degrees. Here's the conventional approach to answering the question of whether something works or not. We calculate a mean average effect, and we look at its difference from the no effect zero line, and if depending upon the power of the sample and the things that we've looked at, if that mean effect is statistically significant, you have earned the designation of being an evidence-based program. That's the way it works. That is the way it works, folks. I hate to say it. It doesn't matter which thing you were measuring. It doesn't matter whether what you were doing you thought was going to achieve this. Sometimes we measure a lot of things, we didn't get what we wanted, but we got some other things, and we were happy we measured a lot. So we were hoping to improve children's behavior, or we were hoping to expand the vocabularies. We didn't get that, but we got a high parent satisfaction score. We got a good retention score, and we changed the parents spanked their kids on average, 2 times less a week, and they read to their kids on an average of 10 minutes more a week, and that was statistically significant from the control group. And that makes it an evidence-based program. But here's an alternative way to think about how we should evaluate the effectiveness of what we're doing. We should be asking the questions, why did it work so well for these children up here? Why did it work so poorly for these children down there? If we can't even begin to answer that, how will we know what's working? And more important, how will we replicate and scale if we don't know why some are doing better and some are doing worse? It would be like taking an average effect of the treatment of cancer and not realizing that acute lymphoblastic leukemia has a 96% cure rate, and pancreatic cancer has a very, very poor 5-year survival rate, and say, well, the average between the two tells you kind of what our effectiveness is for cancer. Nobody would ever begin to think about that, but that's what we're doing for poverty, okay? So if we started to ask these questions, and thankfully we have, and we'll hear about some of it today, we have people who are increasing and deepening our scientific understanding of how we might go about asking and answering those questions. What is it about constitutional differences in kids? What is it about the impact of the environment on gene expression related to certain parameters that we're interested in? What is it about the physiological disruptions that are or are not amenable to this kind of treatment? And maybe the answer is they're amenable to something else. Or maybe this treatment is good for one thing, but not good for something else. And if we did that, we could then very quickly, after a replication that showed something works for a particular subpart of the population, we could start scaling that to get population effects just for those children and families and go back to the drawing board for the others and not scale or have them tag along because on average will show a good effect. And in the end, we will have a diversified portfolio of strategies that match different intervention strategies to different kinds of children and families and their needs. And that's kind of where it needs to go. So let me end with one of, I don't know how many quotes have been attributed to Albert Einstein, and some of them he probably said, and maybe some of them he didn't say, but I would bet he said something close to this. And Einstein is not a bad guy to reference at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, even though he was at Princeton. This has to be the marching orders for those of us who care about early adversity and its consequences later, whether we are scientists or practitioners or policymakers or thought leaders or investors who are trying to figure out how am I going to get the best return on my investment. We have to raise new questions, and we can't do this in isolation. It happens best when these are brought together. Raise new questions, new possibilities, regard old problems from a new angle, requires creative imagination, and marks a real advance in science. So, I can't even begin to try to figure out what it was about Einstein's brain that had a capacity for creative thinking. I don't know. That's crazy. But this notion of we need creative thinking and we need rigorous science to come together, and then to translate that into not just better understanding of this phenomenon, but a better ability to then go out and start in a protected environment where it's not only okay to fail, but it's a prerequisite to breakthroughs to allow failure so we can learn from it and do better. That's where the field has to go. That's the beauty of the different voices that are going to be here at the conference today. And I thank you for the honor of being able to come up here and try to tee off the day. Here's our website, which I'm putting not for self-promotion, but we have a lot of materials on there that have kind of worked hard at translating complex science for non-scientists, particularly focused on policymakers and practitioners, and invite some of you who are interested in some of this stuff to go trolling around on the website. So thank you very much.